The morning Alina Ashford scrubbed the east grate, she did it on her knees, the way she did everything that needed doing around the estate, without ceremony, without complaint, and without anyone watching. The coal dust settled into the creases of her knuckles and stained the hem of her plain grey dress, and she was glad for it. She was always glad for it. The soot was not a punishment. It was armor. It was the most useful thing she owned. The estate sat 3 miles outside Bath, far enough from town that the sound of carriages on the main road reached them only as a faint percussion on still afternoons. Ashford Hall was not grand. It had once been grand in her father's time, when the windows were washed regularly, and the lawns received proper attention, and the servants numbered more than 5. Now the windows showed their age in a particular film of grime that Alina had accepted as part of the landscape. The lawns were managed by old Henry Fletcher, who could only work mornings and whose back gave out before noon, and the servants who remained, Mrs. Poole the housekeeper, the cook Agnes, 2 young maids named Lucy and Dora, and Henry himself, ran the house on a schedule that Alina had written out in careful columns and pinned to the kitchen wall. She was the one who kept the columns accurate. Her father, Lord Edmund Ashford, had died 18 months ago, leaving behind the estate, a modest but workable income tied to the tenant farms to the north, and a set of accounts that had been managed in his final years with a level of carelessness that made Alina's jaw tight every time she opened the ledgers. She had spent the first 4 months after his death simply untangling what he had let go. It was the kind of work that required patience and a clear head, and a willingness to sit with ugly numbers until they told you the truth, and Alina was good at all 3 of those things. She was good at many things that people did not expect her to be good at. Her younger sister Cecily sat at the breakfast table most mornings with a cup of tea and a novel, and the particular expression of a young woman who believed the world would eventually arrange itself into something pleasant if she simply waited long enough. Cecily was 22. She had their mother's coloring, warm and fair, with a natural prettiness that drew eyes without effort. She had not yet been to London for a season. Alina had not discouraged this. Alina had also not encouraged it, which Cecily felt more keenly than an outright refusal. "You could at least sit with me at breakfast," Cecily said that morning, not looking up from her novel, like a person. "I have been up since 5, Alina said, washing her hands at the kitchen basin. "I have already been a person for several hours." "You have been a coal miner for several hours. There is a difference." Alina dried her hands on a cloth and looked at her sister with something that was almost affectionate. "The east grate was blocked. If I had left it, Agnes would have had no fire for the midday meal, and you would have been telling me about that instead." Cecily turned a page. "I would have endured a cold meal." "You would not have." "I might have." Alina poured herself tea and sat down across from her sister, and for a moment the kitchen was quiet in the way that houses are quiet when everyone in them knows each other well enough that silence is not uncomfortable. The autumn light came through the window at a low angle and caught the steam rising from their cups, and Alina looked at it and thought, as she often did in unguarded moments, that the hall was still beautiful in its way. Worn and a little tired, the way things are beautiful when they have been used honestly. She did not think about London. She had not thought about London in 3 years, or she had trained herself not to think about it in a way that felt, most days, nearly the same as actually not thinking about it. The tenant farms to the north were managed by a man named Geoffrey Oakes, who had worked the land for Alina's father for 12 years, and who understood horses and weather and soil drainage better than he understood columns of numbers. Alina drove out to see him twice a week in the small gig, along the rutted lane that cut through the lower field, and they would walk the property together and talk about what needed attention and what was already past saving. Geoffrey was a quietly capable man who wore the same hat in all weather, and who trusted Alina's judgment on the accounts the way he trusted his own on a late frost. "The Mercer tenancy is behind again," he told her one Tuesday in October, walking the edge of the north field where the drainage ditch was starting to flood. 3 months now." "I know," Alina said. "I have written to them. I will write again." "The old man is unwell." "I know that too." She looked at the ditch. The water was standing where it should not stand. "We need to clear this before the real rain comes. Can Henry manage it, or do we need to hire someone?" "Henry's back will not manage a ditch." "Then we hire someone." She made a note in the small book she kept in her coat pocket. "I will find the money." She always found the money. It was not always easy and it was never comfortable, but she found it, the way a woman finds what she needs when there is no one else to find it for her. The estate was not failing. She had made sure of that. It was not prospering either, but it was steady, and steady was what she had decided to ask of it. She had stopped asking more of most things. When Alina Ashford had been 19, she had been, and this is the word people used, the people who had seen her at that time, remarkable. Not simply pretty, not simply well-dressed, though she had been both. She had the kind of face that made a room reorganize itself around her without her doing anything at all, the kind of face that men wrote letters about and women privately resented and everyone in their own way wanted something from. She had gone to London for her season with her mother, who was still alive then, and with the particular hope of a young woman who does not yet know that hope is sometimes the most dangerous thing you can carry. The season had gone well in all the ways that a season measures well. Invitations, dance cards that filled before she had finished entering the room, men who were charming and men who were less charming but richer and men who were neither but persistent. She had not been foolish about it. She had been careful, the way her mother had raised her to be careful, and she had enjoyed herself, the way a young woman enjoys herself when the world is briefly, genuinely interested in her. And then one evening at a house in Mayfair, at a gathering she had attended with a friend, something had happened that changed the shape of her life so completely that it was like a door she had been standing in front of had simply vanished, leaving only wall. She did not think about it in specific terms. She had taught herself not to do that. What she had kept, what she had carried away from that evening and every evening since, was a lesson, clear and cold as well water, that beauty was not a gift. It was an invitation that other people felt entitled to accept without her permission. And so she had removed the invitation. She had come home from London, and she had put away the silk dresses, and she had let her hair go simple, and she had picked up the coal bucket, and she had kept going. 3 years, she had been keeping going for 3 years. Cecily knew something had happened. Their mother had known. Neither of them had ever asked Alina directly about it, and Alina had not offered, and this was an arrangement that suited all three of them in their different ways. What Cecily knew was that her sister, who had once been the loveliest young woman in any room she entered, now dressed like a land agent and kept her hair in a knot so severe it looked like a decision, and that asking Alina to change this was like asking the house to rearrange its own foundations. She asked anyway occasionally. She was still 22, and she believed in the possibility of change. "There is a gathering at the Hartley house on Friday," Cecily said one evening, looking up from a letter she had received that afternoon. "Mrs. Hartley has invited us both. She said specifically that she hoped to see you." Alina did not look up from the ledger she was correcting. "Mrs. Hartley is very kind." "She is. She also has a very pleasant drawing room, and I am told, a new piano. You should go and play it." "Alina." "Cecily." A pause. Cecily set down her letter. She looked at her sister the way people look at a problem they have been turning over for a long time and have not managed to solve. "You are not old," she said. "You are 25, you are—" She stopped. Alina looked up then. Her eyes were gray and very steady. "I am what?" Cecily met her gaze and with the courage of a younger sister who had been practicing this particular speech for months, said quietly, "You are still you, underneath all of it, and I think sometimes you forget that." Alina was quiet for a moment, then she looked back at her ledger. "Go to the Hartley gathering," she said. "Take Lucy with you and wear the blue dress. It suits you." Cecily went. Alina stayed home and fixed the numbers that old Mr. Ashford had let go wrong and listened to the wind come in off the fields, and if she thought of her sister's words as she worked, she did not let herself stay with them long. She was good at not staying with things. November came in cold that year, with rain that arrived in sheets, and a wind that found every gap in the hall's aging windows and made itself at home inside. Alina had the chimneys inspected, and the worst of the window seals repacked with new putty, and she arranged for a cord of wood to be delivered and stacked in the yard before the lanes turned too soft for heavy carts to manage. She thought about these things the way other women might think about their wardrobes or their social calls, with genuine attention, with the pleasure that comes from problems that have real solutions. She was crossing the yard one afternoon in the rain, carrying a basket of correspondence from the gate post to the house, when she saw something that stopped her, a horse tied to the post at the front of the hall. A very good horse. The kind of horse that does not belong to land agents or tradesmen, the kind that is groomed with daily attention and shod with more care than most people give to their own shoes. Its saddle was plain but excellent. worn in the way that excellent things are worn when they are used regularly by someone who knows their value. Elena looked at the horse for a moment. Then she went inside and found Mrs. Poole in the entrance hall with an expression on her face that communicated both surprise and a kind of breathless uncertainty. "A gentleman arrived not 10 minutes ago," Mrs. Poole said. "He asked for the estate manager. I told him we had no estate manager, and he said he had business with whoever kept the accounts, and I told him that was you, and she paused, as if she was still processing the memory. He said he would wait in the estate office." Elena set down her basket. She looked at Mrs. Poole. "Who is he?" "He gave his card." Mrs. Poole held it out. Elena took it and read it. The name on the card was James Wyndham. Below the name in smaller print, Duke of Ashwick. Elena looked at the card for a moment. Then she looked at her hands, which were ink-stained from the morning's work. She looked at her dress, which was plain and dark, and had a small tear near the left pocket where it had caught on a nail 3 weeks ago, and she had mended it herself with thread that was almost but not quite the right color. She looked at her hair, which was pinned up in its usual severe knot, and at her face, which she could not see but knew, without looking, was free of any particular effort at appearance. She straightened her spine. She went to her own estate office. He was standing at the window when she came in, his back to her, looking out at the yard and the rain and the dark line of trees beyond the fence. He was tall. He wore riding clothes that were plain and well-made and had the same quality as his horse, nothing excessive, nothing decorative, everything exactly as it should be. He turned when he heard the door, and Elena saw his face. He was not what she had expected. She was not sure what she had expected from the card. He was perhaps 35, with dark hair that was slightly damp at the edges from the rain, and a face that had the quality of something that had been worked on by weather and thought in roughly equal measure. He was not soft. He was not particularly warm, not in the way of a man who moves through rooms trying to be liked. He was simply present, fully and completely, in the way of a man who has never wasted much time anywhere and does not intend to start now. His eyes found her immediately. They were dark and very direct, and they moved across her face with the kind of quick, accurate attention that she associated more with accountants than with dukes. "You keep the accounts," he said. It was not a question. "I do," Elena said. "Good." He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and produced a folded document. "I have a matter that requires some urgency. The estate that borders your northern boundary, Ashwick Park, is mine. My steward died 6 weeks ago and left the accounts in a state of some disorder. I have been told that the land agent who manages your northern farms is the most capable in the county, and I need to speak with someone who understands the drainage arrangements that your property and mine share along the creek line. There is a dispute with a tenant that requires historical documentation I do not have." Elena took the document he was holding out. She unfolded it. It was a survey map, old, with handwritten annotations in at least 3 different hands. She recognized the boundary line immediately. She also recognized one of the annotations, which was in her own father's writing. "This is from 1831, she said. "Yes, I know the date. The drainage arrangements changed in 1838. My father renegotiated them with your predecessor's steward." He was quiet for a moment. "And you have documentation of that renegotiation?" "I have everything," Elena said. She crossed to the filing cabinet against the east wall, the filing cabinet that she had reorganized 4 months ago and that now contained every document relating to the estate back to 1809, in date order, in labeled folders, and she found what she needed in under 3 minutes. She brought the folder to the desk and opened it and spread the relevant papers out in order and began explaining. He listened. She had spoken with men who listened as a kind of performance, nodding at the correct intervals and looking interested while their attention was somewhere else entirely. This man listened the way she read ledgers, with complete and undecorated attention, taking in what she said and processing it and asking, when he had a question, questions that were precise and showed he had understood everything that came before. He asked 4 questions, all 4 were good ones. Elena answered them, and when she had finished, he looked at the papers she had laid out and then he looked at her, not the way men had looked at her in London, not that way at all, but with the same direct and assessing quality he had brought to the documents, and he said, "How long have you been managing this property?" 3 years, she said. "Alone?" "With Geoffrey Oakes on the land side, alone on the accounts?" He nodded once. He began folding his copy of the survey back into his pocket. "I will need copies of the 1838 documents. My solicitor will want to see them. I can have them ready by Thursday." "Tomorrow," he said, not rudely, simply as a statement of preference. Alina looked at him. "Tomorrow," she agreed. He picked up his hat from the chair where he had left it, and he looked around the room for a moment, at the filing cabinet, at the orderly desk, at the single candle burning in the gray afternoon light, and something moved briefly across his face that she could not quite name. Then he said, "Thank you for your time," and he meant it. She could hear that he meant it, and he went out. Alina stood in the estate office for a moment after she heard the front door close. She stood there and listened to the rain and the sound of a very good horse being untied from the post and the diminishing sound of hooves on the wet gravel lane. She looked down at her ink-stained hands. She looked at the papers still spread on the desk from where she had explained the boundary arrangements, and the notes she had made in the margins during their conversation, and the one moment when his hand had been near hers as he pointed to a notation on the map, and she had been aware of it with a sharpness that she immediately, firmly, put somewhere dark and closed the door. She began putting the papers away. She put them in order as she always did, and she labeled the folder as she always did, and she put it back in the cabinet and closed the drawer. She was fine. She was perfectly fine. She had a meeting with Jeffrey Oakes in the morning and a letter to write to the Mercer tenancy, and the East Grate would need checking again before the week was out. She went to find her supper. Cecily was already at the table, animated in the way she got when she had something to say and had been waiting to say it. She had clearly been watching from an upstairs window. "Who was that?" she said, before Alina had finished sitting down. "A neighbor," Alina said. "Business." "A very well-mounted neighbor." "Yes." Cecily looked at her sister with wide and interested eyes. "He was here nearly an hour. We had documents to review." "Alina," Cecily leaned forward. "Who was he?" Alina looked at her plate. "The Duke of Ashwick," she said, in the same voice she would have used to say the weather had been wet. The silence that followed this was the kind that has texture. "The Duke of Ashwick," Cecily said slowly as if trying out each word for weight. "James Wyndham." "Yes, the one that Lady Hartley said never comes to the county. He came today. And he came here. He has business with the northern boundary." Cecily sat back in her chair. She had the expression of a woman who has just seen a hand of cards that she had not expected. "And what did you think of him?" Alina took a bite of her supper. She chewed it, she swallowed. "I thought his questions were good ones," she said. "Pass the bread." Cecily passed the bread. She did not say anything else that evening about the Duke of Ashwick or his questions or his horse. But she smiled into her soup in a way that she did not bother to hide, and Alina did not bother to tell her to stop. Outside, the rain came down harder. The hall settled into its evening creaking and sighing. Alina ate her meal and thought about the 1838 boundary documents, and whether she needed to make one copy or two, and she did not think about gray eyes meeting gray eyes across a desk, or the precise way a man can listen when he is actually interested, or the feeling of a door she had believed was gone forever shifting, just slightly, somewhere deep in the foundation of her. She was good at not thinking about things. She was getting a little less good at it. She made 2 copies of the documents that night by candlelight in her careful handwriting. When she finished, she blew out the candle and went to bed. She lay in the dark and listened to the rain and thought, just once, about the horse tied to the post, and the card with the name on it, and the moment his eyes had moved to her face with that particular quality of attention. Then she thought about the East Grate, and the Mercer tenancy and the cord of wood in the yard, and eventually she slept. The next morning she was up before the house, and by the time Lucy had come down to start the kitchen fire, Alina was already at her desk with the copied documents in a neat folder on the corner, her ink dry and her handwriting straight, everything in order, everything ready, everything exactly as it should be. She told herself this was how she preferred things. The folder sat on the corner of her desk all morning, waiting to be collected. She was aware of it the entire time. James Wyndham had not come to the county to be impressed by anyone. He had not come to the county for any reason that interested him, which was, in itself, unusual. Wyndham was a man who did not do things that did not interest him, and he had arranged his life with some care to ensure this remained possible. He had estates in 3 counties and a house in London, and a small property in Wales that he visited in August and never showed to guests. He had obligations and responsibilities that he met with efficiency and without complaint. He had a sister he was fond of and a solicitor he trusted, and a handful of men he considered friends in the loose way that men who are not particularly social use that word. He had, in short, everything that a man of his position was supposed to have. He did not have a wife. He had come close once 7 years ago, and the experience had been instructive in all the ways that painful experiences are instructive, and what he had taken from it was not bitterness, exactly, but a clear-eyed understanding of his own nature. He was not easy to live with, he was not particularly interested in the rituals of courtship, and he was not going to pretend to be either of those things simply because society had an opinion about it. His sister, Lady Harriet Caldwell, had a different opinion, which she expressed regularly and without invitation. "You are going to die alone in that office," Harriet said, on the morning he left London for Bath, standing in the entrance hall of his townhouse with her arms crossed and her expression somewhere between affectionate and genuinely frustrated. "Surrounded by ledgers, your solicitor will find you." "My solicitor visits on Tuesdays," Wyndham said, pulling on his gloves. "I will make sure to be alive on a Tuesday." "You know what I mean. I know that you and I have had this conversation many times. And you never listen." He looked at his sister, who was 41 and had been married for 15 years to a good-natured man named Charles Caldwell, who thought Harriet was the most interesting person in England, which she was. Wyndham liked Charles. He was grateful for Charles, specifically for the fact that Charles kept Harriet occupied enough that her campaign on Wyndham's behalf had remained a verbal one rather than escalating to something more organized. "I am going to deal with the Ashwick accounts," he said. "I am going to resolve the drainage dispute. I am going to be back in London before the end of the month." "And while you are there," Harriet said, with the particular lightness of a woman who has been planning what comes next for some time, "you might call on the neighbors." "I am not interested in calling on the neighbors. The Ashford estate is directly adjacent. Lady Eleanor Ashford runs it herself, apparently. She is considered rather remarkable with an account book." A pause. "She is also, or was, quite remarkably lovely, though no one has seen much of her in recent years." Wyndham picked up his hat. "I need someone who can tell me about the Creek Line drainage from 1838. If this Lady Ashford has that documentation, I will call, for that reason." Harriet smiled in the way that meant she had already won something, even if Wyndham had not noticed it yet. "Of course," she said. The ride to Bath took 2 days. Wyndham used the time as he always used travel time, thinking through the Ashwick accounts, running numbers in his head, making a list of what he needed and in what order. His steward, a man named Porter who had served Ashwick for 20 years, had died of a fever in September, and what he had left behind in the estate records was the kind of creative documentation that only becomes visible when someone competent finally opens the books and looks directly at it. Wyndham had looked directly at it. He had been doing very little else since October. The estate itself was not in trouble. Porter had been careless, not dishonest, and most of what needed doing was a matter of imposing order on a filing system that had been run, apparently, on instinct and habit rather than any formal method. But the northern boundary dispute with the Mercer tenant, a man who was claiming that the drainage arrangements gave him rights over a portion of the creek bank that Wyndham did not believe he had, required historical documentation that Porter had either never kept or had misfiled so thoroughly that 3 weeks of searching had not turned it up. Someone in the county had told his solicitor that the Ashford estate kept meticulous records going back to at least 1800. Wyndham had decided to go and see for himself. He arrived at the Ashford gate on a Tuesday afternoon in November, in the rain. The estate was smaller than he expected. The house itself was a respectable size but clearly working on a budget, with fresh putty around the windows and a yard that was tidy but not decorated, everything functional and nothing excessive. He tied his horse and knocked and was shown to a waiting room and then redirected on his own request to the estate office. He went there and waited, standing at the window looking at the rain in the yard. He heard the door. He turned. The woman who came in was not what he had expected, which was itself notable, because Wyndham was not often wrong about what to expect. She was not the housekeeper he had half anticipated. She was not young, or rather, she was young clearly, but she had arranged herself in a way that discouraged the observation. Plain dark dress, hair in a knot so tightly controlled it looked structural, no adornment of any kind, ink on her hands. She crossed the room to the desk without ceremony and met his eyes with the kind of directness that he associated with people who are not in the habit of being intimidated by anyone's name or title. Her eyes were gray. They were very gray and very clear, and the intelligence in them was immediate and not at all decorative. "You keep the accounts," he said. He already knew she did. He could see it in the room, the filing cabinet with its labeled drawers, the orderly desk, the annual ledgers visible on the shelf in date order, but he wanted to hear her say it. "I do," she said. He asked his questions, she answered them. He was not easily impressed by other people's minds, and he had stopped pretending to be impressed when he was not, years ago, because pretending was exhausting and pointless. He was impressed now without pretending. She knew the documents she needed before he finished asking for them. She found them in under 3 minutes in a system that made immediate logical sense. She explained the 1838 renegotiation with the kind of clarity that comes not from memorization, but from genuine understanding. She knew why the arrangements had changed, not just what they were, and she could read the implications in the old annotation as easily as he could. He asked 4 questions. He had intended to ask 2, but she was explaining things that prompted more questions, and he had enough self-awareness to follow a good mind when he found one. When he left, he took the information he needed, and the promise of copies by the following day, and also something he had not come looking for, something he had not identified yet, and did not try to identify as he rode back toward the inn at Bath in the rain. He identified it later, sitting alone at a table by a fire with supper he was not particularly tasting, going back over the conversation in his mind the way he went over accounts, looking for what he might have missed, checking the totals. The gray eyes, the complete absence of performance, the 3 minutes to find a document in a system built from scratch. The fact that she had answered his questions and then waited, without filling the silence while he thought. He thought about all of those things, separately and then together. He also thought about something he had noticed, and then deliberately set aside, that she had done something in the room with her posture or her expression or some quality he could not name, that made him feel he was seeing only the surface of something much larger, like reading the front page of a letter that clearly has more pages behind it. He was curious about the pages behind it. This was not a thing he felt often. He noted it the way he noted things that were unexpected in a set of accounts, without alarm but with attention. The following morning he sent his groom to collect the copies, because he had work to do and because writing out himself on the basis of a curiosity felt undisciplined. The groom returned with a neat folder, the copies inside done in handwriting that was the most legible he had seen outside of a professional copyist, and a brief note in the same hand saying that if he had further questions about the documentation, she would be available on Thursday mornings. Wyndham read the note twice, he set it aside, he worked on the accounts. On Wednesday afternoon his sister's letter arrived, which he had been expecting. It was 4 pages, which he had also been expecting. The relevant section was on the 3rd page. "I have been asking around about Lady Alina Ashford since you mentioned the estate, and I have found something rather interesting. She was apparently the great sensation of the 1844 season. You will not remember because you were in Scotland being relentlessly productive, and then she simply disappeared from society. No explanation. Her mother died the following year and people assumed grief, but one hears things, James, and what one hears is that something happened in London at a Mayfair gathering that the Ashford family chose not to discuss. She came home and has not come back. People who have seen her in the county say she looks quite different now, plain dresses and no effort whatsoever. I find her either very interesting or very sad, and I am not yet certain which. Do call on the neighbors." Wyndham read this, and then folded the letter and put it in his desk drawer. He was not a man who investigated other people's histories out of curiosity. He did not think of it as his business, and he had been on the other end of too much unwanted attention about his own history to find the practice appealing. Whatever had happened to Alina Ashford in London in 1844 was her own matter, and he had no reason to speculate about it. He thought about it anyway. He thought about it with the same focused attention he brought to a set of unusual accounts, trying to see what the surface was covering, what the numbers underneath were actually saying. A woman of 22 at the height of a London season. A woman of 25 managing 400 acres alone in plain wool dresses and coal dust. The distance between those two things was not the distance of grief or retirement or simple preference. It was the distance of a specific event. He closed the desk drawer. On Thursday morning, without particularly deciding to, he rode out to the Ashford estate himself. He told himself it was because he had a question about the 1831 survey that the copies had not fully answered. This was true. It was not the only true thing. She was in the yard when he arrived, speaking with an older man he took to be the land agent, holding a piece of paper and pointing at something in the distance with the brisk, competent gesture of someone who is giving instructions they expect to be followed. She looked up when she heard his horse. She showed nothing on her face, which was itself a kind of showing something. There was a notation on the 1831 survey, he said, swinging down from the saddle. Second panel, lower left. The handwriting is different from the rest. I need to know whose it is and when it was added. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said something to the land agent, who nodded and walked away toward the fields, and she turned and went inside, and he followed her. They spent 40 minutes in the estate office. She answered his question about the notation in the first 3 minutes. The remaining 37 minutes were something else, something that did not have a name in the vocabulary he usually used for business calls, though it looked exactly like one from the outside, papers on the desk, questions asked and answered, two people standing close enough to the same document to read it together. He came back the following Tuesday. He had a different question. It was also a good question. She had the answer. He began to understand, dimly, that he was not entirely running out of questions for the same reason a man does not run out of questions when he is reading a book he does not want to put down. He had not read a book he did not want to put down in a very long time. His groom, who had been with him for 8 years and knew better than to comment on anything, said nothing when they turned north toward the Ashford Lane for the 3rd time in 10 days. He simply followed and waited and kept the horses in good order, which was what he was paid to do. Wyndham was not sure what he was paying himself to do. He was not sure he needed to name it yet. He arrived at the estate office on the Tuesday and found it empty. He heard from somewhere in the direction of the kitchen the sound of Mrs. Poole's voice explaining something to someone, and then he heard Eleanor's voice answering, and then he heard footsteps on the stone floor, and then she appeared in the doorway in her usual dark dress with her usual controlled hair and her hands that had the ink on them that were, he had noticed on each of his 3 visits, never entirely clean. She looked at him, he looked at her. I have a question about the drainage coefficient on the east tributary, he said. Sit down, she said, this will take a few minutes. He sat down. It took 20 minutes. When it was done, he stayed another 15. They talked about the Mercer tenancy situation, and then, briefly, about the agricultural reports for that season, which she had read and had opinions about that were precise and well-reasoned. She listened to his counterpoint without interrupting, and then told him where she thought it fell short in 2 sentences that were exactly right. He was quiet for a moment after that. You have read the quarterly agricultural reports, he said. I read whatever is useful. Most people find them difficult to follow. Most people read them looking for confirmation of what they already think, she said. I read them looking for what I have missed. He looked at her for a long moment. She met his eyes with the gray steadiness he had come to think of as specifically hers, as much a characteristic of her as the ink on her hands or the precise and deliberate way she moved through the office without touching anything that was not necessary. He thought, not for the first time, about what the pages behind the front page said. He did not ask. He stood up and took his hat and said he would likely need to consult her again next week on a matter relating to the Northern Field Survey. Tuesday morning, she said, I am available until noon. He said good morning, she said good morning. He went out to his horse and rode back toward Bath in the cold, bright November air and spent the ride thinking, with the focused attention he usually reserved for problems that required solving, about the 1844 season and a gathering in Mayfair, and a woman who had come home and never gone back. He thought about what could make a woman rearrange her entire existence. He thought about what kind of person looks at that rearrangement from the outside and decides, with certainty, that it was the right choice. He did not think anything simple or easily named. He thought in the way of a man who has learned, over many years of reading numbers, that the most important information in any document is almost never the thing that is written down. It is the thing that is conspicuously absent. The absence here was very large. It had the size and weight of something significant, and the woman who had arranged that absence was the most quietly compelling person he had encountered in longer than he could precisely measure. He rode back to Bath, he worked through the evening, he wrote to his solicitor about the Mercer tenancy. He did not write to his sister. Harriet would find out soon enough, she always did. He fell asleep that night with the Ashwick account spread across his desk, and the window dark and the fire low, and the last thought he had before sleep was not about the accounts. It was about gray eyes reading a column of figures with the particular quality of attention that knows what it is looking for. He slept well for the first time in several weeks. This too he noticed. He did not for once ignore the noticing. Eleanor was in the estate office at 7 in the morning the day the east gutter gave out completely, which meant she was standing at her desk in her work coat with a cup of tea in one hand and a letter from the solicitor in the other, when the sound of water hitting the stone floor of the entrance hall told her that the temporary repair from September had lasted approximately as long as she had been afraid it would last. She put down the tea. She put down the letter. She went to find Henry Fletcher, who was already coming toward her from the direction of the back passage, with the expression of a man who has just watched something he warned about happen. "East gutter," he said. "Yes," she said. "I heard." They went together to look at it. The damage was what she had expected. A section of the lead gutter that ran along the east roofline had finally separated at the joint, and the water coming off the roof was running straight down the exterior wall and finding its way through the ground floor window frame and pooling on the entrance hall floor in a way that was, if not catastrophic, certainly urgent. Eleanor looked at it for a moment, calculating. She would need a roofer. She would need it done before the next rain, which Henry said was 2 days away at most. She would need to move the hall table and the 2 chairs that were currently getting wet. She went back to her desk and found the money and wrote the note to the roofer and sent Lucy with it. And then she moved the table herself because it was faster than waiting for anyone else to do it. And then she went back to her desk and picked up the solicitor's letter. It was from a firm she had not corresponded with before, a London firm, it said, representing certain interests in the estate of the late Mr. Jeremiah Poole of Bath, who had been, the letter informed her, the steward of the Ashwick estate for 20 years before his death in September. The letter was polite and formal, and asked whether Lady Ashford would be willing to assist the executor in tracing certain documentation relating to historical boundary arrangements between the Ashford and Ashwick properties, and whether she would be available to receive a representative of the estate for that purpose. Eleanor put the letter down. She looked at the window. The rain from the gutter damage had stopped now that the water was draining elsewhere, but the mark it had left on the stone floor was still wet, a dark irregular shape spreading out from the base of the wall. A representative of the estate, the letter did not say who. She thought about the card on her desk, James Wyndham, Duke of Ashwick, and the 3 visits in 10 days, and the questions that had been genuinely good questions and had also been, she suspected, not entirely the reason for the visits. She was suspicious of this. She was suspicious of herself for the fact that she had noticed it and had not been entirely displeased. She wrote back to the solicitor's firm. She said she would be available Thursday morning. She did not say that she already knew the man who would likely be coming, or that she had been thinking. In the small, careful way, she was allowing herself to think about things she had stopped thinking about gray eyes and precise attention, and a man who asked 4 questions when other men would have asked 1 and called it thorough. She sent the letter. She made the cup of tea she had set down earlier. She sat down at her desk with the ledger open, and the morning light coming in at the eastern window, and the smell of old paper and coal smoke, and the particular quiet of a house that runs on work. Her sister came down at 8:30 with her hair not yet pinned and her dressing gown on, which she was not supposed to wear past the upstairs corridor, and stood in the kitchen doorway looking at Eleanor with the patient expression of someone who has a question they are waiting for the right moment to ask. The right moment, apparently, was now. "He came 3 times last week," Cecily said. Eleanor did not look up from the ledger. "He has documentation questions." 3 sets of documentation questions. "The Ashwick records are in some disorder. He needs historical reference." "Eleanor," Cecily came into the kitchen and sat down across the table. She folded her hands in front of her in the way she did when she was preparing to be serious, which happened perhaps twice a year. He is a duke. I am aware. He rides 3 miles in the rain to ask you about drainage coefficients. Elena looked up then. She looked at her sister's face, which was open and curious and not unkind, and she felt something tighten briefly in the center of her chest and then release again. She was very good at releasing things. He has legitimate business requirements, she said. He could send a letter. Elena was quiet for a moment. Cecily leaned forward. What is he like? She said more quietly. Not the Duke, him, what is he actually like? Elena thought about this. She thought about it the way she thought about a column of numbers that added up to something unexpected, turning it over, looking at it from different angles, checking the total twice. He listens, she said finally. He truly listens. Not the way men listen when they want you to finish so they can speak. He listens the way you read a document you are trying to understand. Cecily was very still. And his questions are good, Elena said. They are the questions a person asks when they have already understood most of the answer and want to confirm the part they are uncertain about. And, Cecily said. Elena looked at her ledger. And nothing, she said. He has documentation requirements. I have the documentation. When the requirements are met, he will stop coming. Cecily looked at her sister for a long moment. Then she unfolded her hands and stood up and went to make herself tea, and she did not say anything else about the Duke of Ashwick, and she managed not to smile in any visible way until her back was turned. Elena went back to her ledger. Outside, the November morning was cold and thin, and the trees were mostly bare now, their branches making precise dark lines against the sky. Elena could see them through the office window when she looked up, which she did not do often but did do once, for just a moment, before she turned back to the columns. The east gutter was repaired by Friday. The roofer charged slightly more than she had budgeted, which meant she needed to realign the December numbers, which she did that same evening by candlelight methodically until everything balanced. It always balanced if you were patient enough with it. She was very patient. She was patient with the numbers and with the house and with Henry's back and with Cecily's novels and with the winter that was coming in fast now off the fields, cold and certain and making itself felt in every room where the fires were not kept up. She was patient with all of it. She had been patient for 3 years. What she was less certain about, and would not have admitted aloud for any reason, was whether she was going to be able to remain patient with herself. She had spent 3 years building a life that was safe in its smallness. She had made it functional and orderly and self-sufficient, and she had done this not because she did not want more but because wanting more required wanting things, and wanting things meant they could be taken from you, and she had made herself a woman to whom nothing more could be taken because she had stopped wanting anything that could be reached. The Duke of Ashwick came on Tuesdays and asked good questions. He listened the way you read a document you are trying to understand. He had dark eyes that were direct and unhurried, and that looked at her face the same way they looked at the survey maps, with genuine attention, not performance. And she discovered in the quiet of her own house at night, with the ledger balanced and the candle burning low, considerably less safe than she had believed. She closed the ledger. She went to bed. She lay in the dark for a long time before she slept, and what she thought about was not the East Gutter, or the Mercer tenancy, or the December accounts. What she thought about was a question she had not asked herself in 3 years, the question she had locked behind the door she had decided was gone. What would it mean to let someone see you? She did not answer it, she was too careful for that. But she did not, for the first time in a long time, push it away either. She let it sit there in the dark, that question, the way you let something you are not yet ready to decide sit on the edge of your desk, present, visible, not yet touched. Morning came as it always did. She got up as she always did. She went downstairs and put on her work coat and found the coal bucket and started her day. But the question came with her, quiet as a shadow, all the way to the east grate. The afternoon the rain drove them both off the south field and into the hall at the same time, was the kind of afternoon that arrives without announcement. Elena had been walking the fence line with Geoffrey Oakes when the sky changed from merely gray to the specific dark gray that means business, and Geoffrey had looked up and said, in his characteristically economical way, "Coming fast." And Alina had agreed, and they had turned back toward the hall with the kind of brisk, unhurried pace that people develop when they have spent years not being rushed by weather. She was halfway across the front yard when she heard hooves on the lane and looked up to see Wyndham coming through the gate at the same determined pace, his riding coat dark with rain that had clearly caught him on the open road. He saw her at the same moment. Neither of them changed pace. They reached the front step at nearly the same time, and Alina opened the door and they both went inside. And Mrs. Poole appeared from the direction of the kitchen with towels, and the expression of a woman who has given up being surprised by the Duke of Ashwick's presence in the entrance hall. "The fire is up in the library," Mrs. Poole said, which was the most diplomatic thing she could have offered under the circumstances. They went to the library. It was a small room, 2 walls of books and a fireplace that was doing its work well, and 2 chairs angled toward it that had been there since Alina's childhood. She had spent many evenings in the left-hand chair reading. Her father had favored the right. She had not thought until now about who might sit in the right-hand chair after him. Wyndham sat in the right-hand chair with the unconscious ease of a man who does not notice symbolic furniture. He had removed his wet coat and draped it over the back. His dark hair was damp at the temples. He looked, Alina thought in the part of her mind she was keeping separate from the rest of herself, entirely comfortable in her library, the way some people are entirely comfortable in spaces that are not theirs, as if they have an innate right to wherever they happen to be. "I was coming to talk to you about the December survey meeting," he said. "The county record office has scheduled it for the 14th. We will both need to appear." "I know," Alina said, settling into the left-hand chair. "I received the notice this morning." "You are comfortable with the documentation we have?" "Entirely." He nodded. He stretched one leg out toward the fire and looked at it for a moment, and then he looked around the room at the books, at the low shelves along the east wall, at the desk in the corner where a small stack of correspondence sat waiting. "This was your father's library," he said. "Yes. You have kept it." "I read." "What?" he said, and it was not a polite question. It was the same kind of question he asked about the accounts, direct, interested, actually wanting the answer. Alina looked at the fire. "Agricultural reports," she said, and almost smiled. "Natural history, whatever comes through the lending library in Bath. Cecily's novels when she leaves them lying around, which she does constantly." "Do you like the novels?" She looked at him. He was watching her with that unhurried attention. "Some of them," she said. "I find most of them deeply optimistic." "Optimistic?" "Things resolve," she said. "People get what they deserve, complications untangle. I find it pleasant enough to read. I am less convinced it resembles life." He was quiet for a moment. The fire made its small sounds. Rain moved across the window in sheets. "It resembles some lives," he said. "Does it resemble yours?" The question came out before she had fully decided to ask it. She felt it leave her mouth and could not take it back, and so she did not try. She met his eyes instead. He looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said, "my complications have not untangled themselves. I have untangled some of them. Others I have simply stopped pulling at." "That is not the same as resolution." "No," he agreed, "it is not." The rain was very loud now against the library window. Alina was aware of the fire and the chair and the small contained world of the room, and of a quality to the silence between them that she had not felt in a long time, the quality of silence between 2 people who are thinking about things they are not yet saying. She reached for the conversation she had been intending to have. "The 14th will require us to have the original 1838 document, not the copies. I have it. I will bring it." "Good." He did not look away from her. "What will you wear?" Alina looked at him, uncertain of the question. "To the county record office," she added unnecessarily. "Whatever is appropriate," she said. "What is appropriate to you?" She looked at him. He was watching her with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, not pressing, simply interested, and she felt something in her, some mechanism she had built and maintained for 3 years shift by a fraction, the way a lock shifts when the right key is in it but you have not yet turned it. "I dress for function," she said. "I have always found that clearest." "Have you always?" he said. And the question was quiet and careful and entirely precise, in the way all his questions were precise, and it sat between them like the 1838 document on the desk, evidence of something, waiting to be read by someone with the right understanding to interpret it. Elena looked at the fire. The fire did not comment. She said after a moment, "I did not always." And then, because she was tired of being careful about everything all the time, she said, "I chose it 3 years ago. I made a decision about how to move through the world, and this is how I have moved through it since." "A decision to disappear," he said, not unkindly. "A decision to be left alone," she said, "which is different." He looked at her for a long time. The rain came down. The fire held its warmth. And then he said, "Was it working?" Elena opened her mouth, closed it. He had used the past tense. She looked at him and he looked at her, and the past tense sat between them as clearly as anything he had ever said to her, which was already clearer than most people managed. "It was working very well," she said carefully, "until recently." He did not smile. He was not, she had learned, much of a person who smiled easily. But something happened around his eyes, a quality of attention that sharpened and softened at the same time, which should not have been possible but was. "Elena," he said, her given name, the first time, no title, no preamble, "I am going to come back on Tuesday." "You always come back on Tuesday," she said. "Not always for the documentation." She held his gaze. "I know," she said. The fire burned down a little. The rain kept at the window. Neither of them moved or spoke for a moment that had the particular quality of a held breath, not uncomfortable, not unresolved, simply present, the way something important is present when it has been acknowledged but not yet fully arrived. Then Mrs. Poole appeared in the doorway with tea, and the moment shifted into something more ordinary, and they drank the tea and talked about the December survey meeting with the practical detail of two people who had real business to conduct, which they did. But underneath all of it, steady as the fire, was the awareness of what had just been named. Not everything, not yet, but enough. Elena walked him out when the rain eased. His horse was composed and dry, Mrs. Poole having had the sense to have Henry stable it during the worst of the downpour. He mounted with the easy movement of a man who has been on horseback his entire life, and he looked down at her from the saddle. "The long gallery," he said, "the roof inspection you mentioned last week. I noticed the water damage on the ceiling from the entrance hall. Before the 14th, the plaster will go if it is not addressed." Elena looked up at him. She had not mentioned the long gallery to him. She had mentioned it to Mrs. Poole in passing 2 visits ago while he had been waiting in the estate office. He had been in the hall, he had looked up, he had noticed. She looked at him for a moment. "I will have it inspected," she said. "I can look at it now if you like. I know what to look for." He did not say why he knew what to look for. She did not ask. "Come back Tuesday," she said. "We will look at it then." Something crossed his face, not quite disappointment, something that was more like the recognition of a boundary that he respected without resenting it. "Tuesday," he said. He rode away down the lane, and Elena stood at the gate in the cold, wet air for a moment after the sound of hooves had faded, her hands in the pockets of her work coat, her hair in its severe knot, her plain dress absolutely appropriate for a woman who had decided to be left alone. She went inside. She went to the library and sat in the left-hand chair and looked at the right-hand chair, which was still slightly warm, and she thought about the past tense of a single word and what it meant that she had not corrected him when he used it. She thought about Tuesday. She thought about the long gallery. She had not been in the long gallery in 8 months. She had been meaning to inspect it. She had been, if she was being honest with herself, avoiding it. The long gallery at the far end of the 2nd floor held the Ashford family portraits, including one specific portrait. She knew, in the way that you know the shape of a room you have not entered in a long time, exactly what she would see if she went there with Wyndham on Tuesday morning, and she knew exactly what he would see, and she knew, with a clarity that was both frightening and strangely like relief, what would happen when he did. She sat with the fire for a long time that evening, not reading, not working, simply sitting. She had been avoiding the long gallery for 8 months because it contained a portrait of a girl she used to be. She thought it might be time to go back. The Tuesday morning came in clear, which was unusual for November, the sky a pale washed blue with the kind of thin winter light that makes everything look like an engraving of itself. Elena was up at 5 as always and through her morning tasks, and at the desk by 7, And when she heard Wyndham's horse on the lane at 9:30, she was already putting away the December accounts in preparation for whatever came next. Mrs. Poole showed him to the estate office, as she always did. Eleanor came in to find him standing at the window again, looking out at the yard where Henry was moving the last of the firewood under the linta before the weather changed. He turned when she came in. "The plaster," he said. "The long gallery," she agreed. They went upstairs. The long gallery ran the full length of the house's eastern wing, a corridor of perhaps 60 feet, lined on one side with tall windows that looked out over the formal garden that was no longer very formal, and on the other with the accumulated portrait work of 4 generations of Ashfords. It was cold up there. The fires in the gallery had not been lit in months, and the winter light came through the windows at the low angle that makes long rooms feel longer. Eleanor had been in this room with her father, with her mother, with Cecily on childhood afternoons. She had not been in it since before London. She walked in with Wyndham beside her, and did not look immediately at the wall of portraits. She looked at the ceiling, where the water damage was visible along the east join, a dark spreading stain that had, in the past 2 weeks, extended approximately 6 inches further than the last time anyone had assessed it. "There," she said, pointing. Wyndham looked up. He studied the damage with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, and then he crossed to the window that was directly below the damage and looked at the frame, and then he went to the wall and touched the plaster near the baseboard where the damp would have traveled downward. "The lead flashing on the east parapet has failed," he said. "It is the same problem I had on the Ashwick east wing 2 years ago. You need a roofer before the next hard frost, or the plaster will go. I had the gutters done in September. This is higher up, the gutters would not have shown it." He turned from the wall, he looked at her. "I can give you the name of the man who did the Ashwick work. He is competent and he is not dishonest about his costs, which is rarer than it should be." "Thank you," she said. And then, because she was standing in the long gallery for the first time in 3 years, and the thing she had been avoiding was behind her, she made a decision. She turned around. The portraits lined the wall from door to far window. She looked past her grandfather, past her great-grandmother, past the small painting of a child who had died young that her father had always looked at without comment, past the one of her parents that had been painted in the 2nd year of their marriage, when everything was still very new. At the far end of the row, in a frame that was slightly larger than the others, because it had been commissioned in the full expectation of a bright future, was the portrait of Eleanor Ashford at 19. She looked at it. She had not looked at it in 3 years. She had walked past the gallery door for 3 years without opening it, because she had not known what she would feel when she did, and she had not wanted to find out. What she felt now was something she had not expected, not grief, not anger, not the old cold fear. She felt something quieter. She felt the way you feel when you look at a photograph of yourself from a time that was both very distant and still entirely recognizable as you. The girl in the portrait was wearing white silk and had her hair arranged in the elaborate style of 1844, and was looking out from the canvas with an expression that was half composed and half something else, something that Eleanor, looking at it now, could only describe as unguarded. The girl in the portrait had not yet learned to guard herself. Eleanor was so absorbed in looking at the portrait that she did not hear Wyndham's footsteps stop behind her. She heard, instead, the quality of his silence. It was a different silence from his others. She had learned his silences over the past weeks, the working silence of a man thinking through a problem, the comfortable silence of a man who does not need to fill space, the brief sharp silence that came when she said something he was going to need to consider. This was none of those. This silence had a different weight. She turned. He was looking at the portrait, then he looked at her, then he looked at the portrait again. She watched him make the connection. She watched it happen in his face, which was controlled but not impenetrable, and she saw the moment the distance closed between what he had been looking at for 3 weeks, the woman in the plain dress with the ink on her hands, and what he was looking at on the canvas. He did not say she was beautiful. He did not say how different she looked. He did not say any of the things that she had been afraid of, the things that would have made her close up immediately and entirely, the things that would have confirmed that the beauty was still the whole of what anyone saw. What he said after a long moment was, "How long have you been doing this?" Eleanor looked at him. 3 years, she said. "Since London." It was not a question. She had not told him about London. But he had the same quality of reading that she had, the same ability to look at a column of figures and understand what was in the missing rows. Since London, she confirmed. He looked at her for another long moment, and in that moment she felt more seen than she had felt in 3 years, and the strange thing was that it was not the portrait he was seeing. He had looked at the portrait and recognized her, but he was looking at her now, the real version, in the plain dress with the controlled hair, and the quality of his attention had not changed at all. He was not looking at what she had been. He was looking at what she was. She breathed in, she breathed out. The winter light was very thin and clear in the long gallery, and the room was cold, and she was standing in a place she had avoided for 3 years, looking at a version of herself she had tried to put away, and the man beside her had recognized her without any of the decorations and was waiting, with his customary patience, for whatever came next. "Will you tell me?" he said. "Not, you can tell me. Not, I want to know, just, will you?" A real question with a real uncertainty in it, which was the first genuinely uncertain thing she had heard him say. She looked at the portrait for another moment. The girl in the white dress looked back. Then Alina said, "Not today." She paused. "But perhaps," she said, "not never." He nodded once. He did not push, he did not fill the space. He simply accepted what she had offered, which was not much, and which was more than she had offered anyone in 3 years. They went back downstairs. They sat in the estate office, and Alina gave him the name of a roofer who was better than the one she had used in September, and Wyndham thanked her without making it into anything more than it was. He left at noon. Alina stood in the estate office after he had gone and looked at the window and the pale blue of the November sky. She thought about the long gallery. She thought about turning around and finding him behind her, looking at the portrait and then at her, and making the connection, and then not saying any of the wrong things. She thought about a question asked without pressure. Not today, but perhaps not never. She sat down at her desk. She opened the December accounts. She put her pen to the page. For a long time, the only sound in the room was the scratch of her pen, and the distant sound of Henry in the yard, and the thin winter wind in the eaves. Then very quietly, Alina Ashford smiled, not at anyone, not for any specific reason, just a small private smile that crossed her face and was gone before anyone could see it, in the way that things are felt before they are understood. She kept writing. Alina had not worn the green dress in 3 years. It had been hanging in the back of her wardrobe behind 2 wool day dresses and a riding habit she no longer used, wrapped in cloth to keep the moths off, and she had been aware of it the way you are aware of something you have decided not to decide about. Its presence noted, its existence managed, its invitation declined without ceremony each time she opened the wardrobe and looked past it. She had taken it out 2 nights before the county survey meeting. She had not put it on. She had held it at arm's length and looked at it in the candlelight, and then she had put it back and gone to bed and lain there for a long time before sleeping. In the morning she had taken it out again. She had put it on. It was not a grand dress. It was not the white silk of the portrait, not the London variety of elegance that had once drawn eyes from across crowded rooms. It was simply a good dress, well cut, in a green the color of copper beech leaves in August, with no ornament beyond the quality of the cloth itself. She had worn it once the autumn before London to a gathering at the Hartley house, and she remembered that her mother had looked at her in it and said, simply and without elaboration, "Good." She wore it to the county record office on the 14th. She also washed her face properly and put her hair up in a style that required a little more time than the usual knot, not an elaborate style, nothing approaching the portrait variety, but a style that acknowledged the existence of effort. She wore her good coat. She wore her only pair of decent gloves. She did not do any of this for Wyndham. She did it, she decided on the way to the gig, for herself. She had been wearing the armor for 3 years and she was, in this one particular instance, choosing to leave part of it at home. County Record Office was in Bath, in a square building near the Abbey that had the smell of old paper and floor wax, and the particular institutional cold of rooms that are heated only on weekdays. The county surveyor, a thin man named Mr. Alton, who had been doing the job for 40 years, and had the manner of a man who found property disputes personally wearying, was already at the table when Alina arrived, with a junior clerk beside him and 2 stacks of documentation in front of him. Wyndham was already there too. He was standing at the side of the room looking at a framed survey map on the wall, his hands behind his back, and he turned when Alina came in. She watched him see her. It was nothing dramatic. He did not stop moving or lose his composure or do any of the things that would have made her regret the green dress immediately and completely. What he did was look at her for exactly 1 moment longer than he usually looked at her when she entered a room, and then he said, "Good morning," in the same voice he always used. "Good morning," she said. They sat down at the table on the same side, because their interests in the documentation were the same, and Alina opened her folder and spread the 1838 agreement in front of Mr. Alton, and the meeting began. It lasted 2 hours. Alina had expected it to last one. The Mercer tenant's solicitor had brought a counterclaim that required the historical documentation to be read in full, section by section, and cross-referenced with the 1831 survey that Wyndham's surveyor had brought, and there were 3 separate points of interpretation that needed to be argued through carefully before Mr. Alton could make his determination. Alina argued 2 of the 3 points. Wyndham argued the third. Between them they covered the ground so thoroughly that the Mercer solicitor ran out of counter-arguments by the end of the first hour and spent the second hour sitting very quietly and looking at his notes with diminishing conviction. Mr. Alton found in their favor on all 3 points. He looked, Alina thought, relieved to be done with it. They came out of the building into the December afternoon, cold and bright, and Alina pulled her coat closer against the chill and felt the particular satisfaction of a problem cleanly resolved, the feeling she got when a column of figures finally balanced and the total made sense. "Well argued," Wyndham said, walking beside her toward where her gig was waiting. "You did the third point better than I would have," she said. "I would have been too direct." "You were direct. You were precisely direct. There is a difference." He looked at her sideways, a very slight thing. "You have been thinking about the distinction between those 2 approaches." "I think about a great many things," she said. They reached her gig. Geoffrey's nephew, a quiet young man named Peter who sometimes drove for her, was waiting with the horse. Alina paused and looked at Wyndham and thought about the long gallery and the question he had asked that she had not yet answered, and the fact that she had worn the green dress today because she was tired of being careful about every single thing. "I am going to take the Bath Road home," she said, "past the south field. The lane through the back of the property has been too soft for the gig since the rain." "I rode the south lane this morning," he said. "It is passable." "Then perhaps I will take it." She looked at him. "You rode from the north. The south road would not suit your direction." "I rode from the west this morning," he said. "I was at the record office early to check the historical map file." A pause. "The south road would suit my direction," he said. Alina looked at him for a long moment. He met her eyes with his customary directness and waited, the way he waited for her answers when he had asked a question that he genuinely did not know the answer to. "Then ride with me to the gate," she said. They went by the south lane, which was indeed passable, the gig moving at an easy pace in the cold afternoon light, Wyndham's horse walking alongside. The fields on either side were stripped down to their winter selves, bare earth, bare hedgerow, the skeleton of the landscape without its seasonal decoration. Alina had always found this time of year honest, everything exactly as it was, nothing covered. They rode in silence for a while, not an uncomfortable silence, the kind that had developed between them over weeks of working together in the estate office, the kind that 2 people fall into when they are comfortable enough in each other's company that they do not need to fill it. "You were not going to wear that dress," Wyndham said. Alina turned to look at him. He was watching the lane ahead. "How would you know what I was going to wear?" "I do not," he said. "I said you were not going to. I think you decided this morning or recently." She looked at the lane. A crow lifted from the hedgerow ahead of them and moved off across the field. "Recently," she admitted. He nodded once as if this confirmed something. He did not ask why, he did not need to. She thought about the long gallery and not today, but perhaps not never, and she thought about how much she had stopped saying aloud in 3 years, and how much effort it cost to keep stopping. "There was a man," she said. She said it to the lane, not to him. It was easier that way. "In London, at a gathering in Mayfair. I went with a friend to a house I did not know well. There was a man there who had been attentive the entire season, who had been charming in the particular way of men who have decided they are entitled to something and are simply waiting for the right moment to reach for it." She paused. The gig wheels moved over the lane. The horse's breath made small clouds in the cold air. "He found his moment," she said, "and then I found my way out of the room." And then I came home and I never went back. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Nothing happened that could not be escaped from. I want to be clear about that. But the understanding of what could have happened, what would have happened without the particular fortune of an unlocked door, that stayed with me." She looked at the lane. She had said this to herself many times in the private accounting of her own history, but she had never said it aloud to anyone. It sounded different said aloud. It sounded smaller than it had felt at the time and also, paradoxically, more real. "And the beauty," Wyndham said quietly, "was what had made you visible to him." "Yes," she said, "so I made myself less visible." He said nothing for a moment. They came to the gate at the south end of the Ashford property. Eleanor's gig stopped. Wyndham's horse stopped beside it. She looked at him. His expression was not pity. She had been afraid of pity, she realized, more than almost anything else, the softening of the face, the reaching for comfort, the reduction of a woman who had managed 400 acres for 3 years and balanced every account and fixed every gutter into someone who needed handling. His expression was something else. It was the quality she had noticed the very first time in the estate office when he had looked at her face with the same attention he had brought to the documents. Only now it was more concentrated. It was the look of a man who has found the correct total after a long time of adding wrong. "The man's name," Wyndham said very quietly. Eleanor looked at him. "Why?" "Because I like to know things accurately," he said. She looked at him for a long moment, then she said the name. He received it the way he received information he found significant, without visible reaction, simply noting it, filing it somewhere in the quiet and organized interior of his mind, where she imagined his important things were kept. He said nothing else about it. He did not say he would ruin the man. He did not say how could this happen. He did not say any of the things that would have made her feel handled. He simply accepted what she had given him, which was everything she had been keeping behind a door for 3 years, and he kept looking at her in that direct and unhurried way. "You are wearing the green dress today," he said after a moment. "Yes," she said. "You wore it for yourself." It was not a question. It was, she thought, the most accurate thing anyone had said to her in 3 years. "Yes," she said. He nodded. He looked at the bare fields beyond the gate and then back at her. "I will be in Bath until the new year," he said, "and then I must return to London for January, but I will be back in February for the estate review." "February," she said. "Unless," he said and stopped. Eleanor waited. "Unless there is a reason to come sooner," he said. She held his gaze. The cold afternoon light was very clear, and the bare fields were very quiet, and she was sitting in her gig at her own gate in the green dress she had worn for herself, and she was less afraid than she had been this morning, and considerably less afraid than she had been 3 years ago, and still afraid, but afraid in a way that felt more like the edge of something than the middle of it. "There are always documentation questions," she said. And something happened in his face, not quite a smile, but the version of it that was more genuine than most people's actual smiles. "There are always documentation questions," he agreed. He rode north. She drove the gig through the gate and up the lane toward the hall. She was almost to the door when Cecily appeared on the step, having clearly been watching from the upstairs window, with her dressing gown replaced by a real dress and her hair actually done. And she looked at Eleanor coming up the lane in the green coat and the green dress, and she said nothing at all, which was how Eleanor knew that her sister was working very hard to contain herself. Eleanor tied the horse at the post. "Cecily," she said, walking past her to the door. "I'm not saying anything," Cecily said, following her inside. "Good. I am merely noting that you look lovely. I wore it for myself." "Yes," said Cecily, in the tone of a woman who believed this completely, and also believed that it was the most promising thing she had heard in 3 years. "Of course you did." Eleanor went to the estate office. She took off her good coat, she put on her work coat, she sat down at the desk. She looked at the window and the winter afternoon and the lane going north where he had gone. She opened the ledger, she picked up her pen. She began to write. He came back in January. He had said February. He arrived on a Tuesday in the second week of January, on a morning when the lane was hard with frost, and the sky was the flat white of a sky thinking about snow. Eleanor was in the estate office with the quarterly accounts when she heard the horse, and she recognized the sound. She had learned to recognize the particular rhythm of that horse on that lane, and she did not look up from the accounts, but she was aware of the sound the way you are aware of something you have been half listening for. Mrs. Poole showed him in. He came into the estate office and stood in the doorway and said, "The Northern Field Survey. There is a discrepancy in the February 1837 recording that I found in the Ashwick archive last week. I need your records for comparison." Alina put down her pen. She looked at him. He was standing in her doorway in a coat damp at the shoulders from the cold air, and he looked exactly as he always looked, which was present, direct, unhurried, and entirely himself. "You said February," she said. "The discrepancy required attention before February," he said. "I have the documentation." She looked at him for a moment, then she said, "Sit down. I will find the 1837 file." She found the 1837 file in under 2 minutes. She brought it to the desk. He sat across from her, and they spread the documents between them, and they began to work. The discrepancy was real. It was also, Alina suspected within the first 10 minutes, the kind of discrepancy that could have waited until February without causing any particular harm to anyone. She did not say this. She worked through it with the same care she brought to everything, and when they had resolved it and she was writing the summary note for her own records, Wyndham said, "My sister is coming to Bath next week. She has been asking to meet you." Alina looked up from the page she was writing. "Your sister?" "Lady Harriet Caldwell. She is," he paused, in the way he paused when he was selecting his words with precision, "she is very direct, and she has been following the Ashwick boundary situation with considerable interest." "Has she?" "She has also been following, with somewhat more enthusiasm, my visits to this property." Alina set down her pen. She looked at him across the desk, at the documents between them, at the ordered and functional room they were sitting in, at the gray January light in the window. She thought about all the Tuesdays that had accumulated between October and now, all the questions good and less good, all the silences and the conversations and the long gallery and the green dress and the South Lane in December. "James," she said, his given name, the first time for her. He went very still, the stillness of a man who has been waiting for something and has just heard it. "Your sister is welcome," Alina said. "I would like to meet her." The winter light sat in the room, thin and steady. "Tuesday," he said. "Tuesday," she said. "Bring her for tea. Mrs. Poole will be pleased to have something more interesting to prepare than the usual." He nodded. He began to gather the documents, folding them with his customary care, and Alina went back to her summary note, and for a few minutes the only sound in the room was the scratch of her pen and the soft movement of paper. Then he said very quietly, without looking up from the document he was folding, "You are not wearing the gray dress today." Alina looked down. She was wearing the green dress. She had not consciously decided to wear it. She had simply opened the wardrobe this morning and taken it out without the deliberation of the first time, without the weeks of consideration, without any particular ceremony. She had simply chosen it because she wanted to. "No," she said. "I am not." He said nothing more about it. He put the folded documents in his case. He stood. He said good morning with the same formality he always used, and she returned it with the same, and he went out, and she heard his horse on the frost-hard lane, and the sound moved away north, and the estate office was quiet. Alina sat for a moment. Then she picked up her pen and finished the summary note, and she was already thinking about Tuesday and Mrs. Poole, and whether Cecily should be invited to tea or whether Cecily's enthusiasm would make the whole thing too much, and she was aware that she was thinking about these things with something that was, if she was honest with herself, something like the pleasure of planning. She had not planned for pleasure in a long time. She wrote Cecily's name at the bottom of the note and crossed it out and wrote it again, and then she stopped crossing it out, because Cecily had been waiting patiently for 3 years for Alina to let the world back in, and the least she could offer was tea. Outside, the frost was still hard on the lane, and the sky was its flat and promising white. She went to tell Mrs. Poole to plan for 4 on Tuesday. The snow came on a Saturday, which was not a Tuesday, and brought with it the particular stillness that snow brings to a property like Ashford Hall, the kind of silence that settles over fields and rooftops, and is not the absence of sound, but the presence of something very quiet. Alina had been in the kitchen garden when the first flakes started, cutting what remained of the winter kale that Agnes used for the midday soup, and she had watched the snow come down into the bare beds for a moment before she went inside. There was something she liked about the garden in winter, stripped of everything seasonal. It showed you the bones of it, the shape that the growing things grew from. Nothing pretending, nothing covering. Lady Harriet Caldwell arrived on Tuesday as promised, with the energy of a woman who has been looking forward to something and is not going to pretend otherwise. She was 41, with Wyndham's dark coloring and none of his economy of expression. Where Wyndham gave you one word when one word would do, Harriet gave you 6 and enjoyed every one of them. She had intelligent eyes and the quality of attention that Alina recognized immediately as the Wyndham family inheritance, deployed in an entirely different way. Where Wyndham's attention was contained and precise, Harriet's was warm and comprehensive and entirely interested in everything it landed on. She shook Alina's hand with both of hers and said, "Finally," which covered an enormous amount of ground in one word. Cecily, who had been invited to tea on the grounds that 4 was more civilized than 3, and also on the grounds that she would never have forgiven being excluded, took to Harriet immediately and completely, in the way that warm people always recognize each other. Within 20 minutes they were discussing the new lending library in Bath, and within 40 they had established mutual opinions on 3 different novels, and a shared conviction that the price of good wool had become unreasonable. Wyndham sat across from Alina with his tea, and observed this convergence with the expression of a man who had expected exactly this, and was not displeased. "She likes everyone," he said, quietly enough that it was just for Alina. "Cecily likes anyone who talks to her as if she is interesting," Alina said. "Most people do not. Most people are wrong about her." Alina looked at him. He was watching Cecily and Harriet with a quality of gentle attention that she had not seen him turn on anything that was not a document, and she felt something move in her, a shift in the particular arrangement of her careful interior world, the kind that happens when you realize something you did not know you had been waiting to realize. He was kind, not demonstratively, not in the way of people who perform their kindness publicly. Quietly kind, the way he was quietly everything else, in a way that only became visible over time and attention. She had been paying attention for 3 months. After tea, Harriet asked if she might see the house, which Alina took as what it was, an invitation to be known, offered from the side rather than directly, and she accepted it in the same spirit. She walked Harriet through the hall, through the rooms she had spent 3 years maintaining and managing and making into a home that worked even if it did not shine, and Harriet asked real questions about the plasterwork in the dining room, about the kitchen garden, about the northern field lease she had apparently been briefed on in some detail. She asked them with genuine interest and listened to the answers with genuine attention. On the stairs, Harriet stopped and said, without particular weight, "He has been different since October." Alina stopped on the step below. She looked up at Harriet, who was looking at her with the frank and not unkind directness of a woman who has decided that the most courteous thing is to be clear. "Different," Alina said. "Less alone," Harriet said. "He is always alone, even in company. He has been different." Alina thought about the estate office and the Tuesdays and the long gallery and a question asked without pressure, and a name said for the first time across a desk. She thought about January and the frost on the lane, and the fact that a discrepancy in the 1837 survey could, in fact, have waited until February. "I am glad," she said, because she was. Harriet smiled. It was a very warm smile. "Yes," she said, "I thought you might be." They went back downstairs. The afternoon light was fading, and the snow on the garden was turning blue in the dusk, and Mrs. Poole had put more coal on the sitting-room fire, and Cecily was telling Harriet about a novel she had finished the previous week, with the specific enthusiasm of a person who has had no one to tell about it for several days. Wyndham was standing at the sitting-room window looking out at the garden, and he turned when Alina came in, and they looked at each other across the room, and what passed between them in that look was not nothing. It was the distance closing. Not closed, Alina was not yet ready for closed, but closing, the way a door closes when someone on the other side is pulling it gently and from the right direction, and with patience enough to wait for it to come. She went and stood beside him at the window. They looked at the snow together. "The drainage ditch will be iced over by morning," she said. "Yes," he said. "Geoffrey will be unhappy about it." "Geoffrey manages." She almost smiled. "He does." They stood there in the fading light while Cecily and Harriet talked behind them, and the snow settled blue and quiet over the winter garden, And Alina Ashford stood beside a man who had looked at the portrait and then at her and asked the right question. And she felt, for the first time in a long time, the precise and particular feeling of not wanting to be anywhere else. She did not name it, she was still being careful. But she was being careful the way a person is careful with something they intend to keep, not the way a person is careful with something they intend to refuse. There was a difference. She had learned these past months that the difference mattered enormously. The letter that arrived from London in the third week of January was addressed to Alina and came from a woman she had not spoken to in 3 years. A friend from the 1844 season named Clara Whitmore, now Clara Pemberton by marriage, who had been at the gathering in Mayfair and who had known some part of what had happened there, and had maintained a careful and respectful distance ever since, understanding without being told that Alina did not want to be asked about it. Clara's letters arrived once a year at Christmas and said only ordinary things, news of her children, news of her husband's work in trade, news of mutual acquaintances who had married or moved or otherwise moved through their lives in the ways that people do. Alina always wrote back. They had been friends once genuinely, and the thread of it had stretched but not broken. This letter was not the Christmas letter. Alina read it at her desk on a Tuesday morning, and what it told her was that a man, the name she had given Wyndham on the South Lane in December, had arrived in Bath for the season. He was staying with friends at a house on the western edge of the county. He had been seen at 2 social gatherings already. Clara had heard from a mutual acquaintance who had seen him that he was asking after people he remembered from London. Clara did not say he was asking after Alina specifically. She did not need to. Alina understood the shape of what was not said, the way she always understood what the absent rows in a column of figures were telling her. He was in the county. He was asking after people. He was exactly the kind of man who, 3 years on, would consider the passing of time to have dissolved whatever had made him unwelcome. Alina folded the letter. She put it in the bottom drawer of her desk. She sat for a moment with her hands flat on the desk surface, feeling the wood under her palms solid and real. Then she took the letter out again. She read it once more slowly. She put it back in the drawer. She thought about 3 years of early mornings and coal buckets and plain dresses, and the specific discipline of making yourself invisible to avoid making yourself a target. She thought about how much it had cost and how necessary it had felt, and how now, sitting in the estate office in January with the frost still on the lane outside, she felt something that was not fear but was the cousin of it, the old alert, the old wariness, the clear sense of something approaching. Wyndham arrived at 9:30. He came into the estate office and looked at her face and said nothing. He sat down across from her. He waited. Alina looked at her hands. "I received a letter this morning," she said, "from a friend in London. The man from the Mayfair gathering is in Bath." The quality of Wyndham's silence changed immediately. She felt it change the way you feel a temperature change in a room, the same air, somehow different. "He is staying with the Harrington family on the Western Road," she said. "He has been seen at 2 gatherings." Wyndham said very evenly, "Is he likely to be at the Hartley gathering on Friday?" Alina had been invited to the Hartley gathering. She had been intending to decline. She had in fact been looking at the invitation for a week and thinking about whether she was ready for the kind of social occasion she had been avoiding, and she had not yet decided, and now there was a new element in the calculation. "I do not know," she said, "possibly." He looked at her. "Do you want to go?" She thought about this honestly. "I was considering it," she said. "Cecily wants me to go, and I have been considering more generally how long I intend to manage my life around where he might be." Wyndham was quiet for a moment. "That is a reasonable thing to consider." "Yes," she said, "it is, but considering it and actually going are different things." "I will be at the Hartley gathering," he said. She looked at him. He looked back at her with the same steady directness he brought to everything, and the thing he was saying, the thing underneath the words, was entirely clear to her. She had spent 3 months learning to read him, and she was good at it now, the way she was good at reading everything she gave proper attention to. He was saying, "I will be there. I will be there if he is there. And if he is there, he will not do what he is thinking of doing, because I will be standing next to you, and he will know who I am, and he will understand very clearly that the calculation he has been making since he arrived in the county is incorrect." He did not say any of this aloud. He simply said, "I will be at the Hartley gathering." Alina sat with this for a long moment. Then she said, I will need to wear something suitable. You have suitable things, he said, with the casual certainty of a man who has noticed what she wears every Tuesday for 3 months and has registered the green dress as a data point. Yes, she said, I do. She looked at the bottom drawer where the letter was. She looked at the window and the frost on the lane and the gray January sky. She thought about 3 years and about the question of how long she intended to manage her life around where he might be. I am going to go, she said, because I want to go and because Cecily wants me there and because I am not going to keep not doing things. She paused. And because you will be there, she added, which was the honest version. Something in Wyndham's face did something she had never quite seen before, not the version of a smile, the actual thing. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds, then he was himself again, composed and direct and entirely present. I will call for you at 7, he said. I will be ready, she said. She was ready at 7. She wore the green dress and her good coat and her hair in a style that had taken more time than usual and which she was doing for herself. And for Cecily, and also, she admitted privately in front of the mirror, for one other person who had not once asked her to change anything. The Hartley house was warm and well lit, and full of the particular noise of people who are enjoying a gathering and also observing everything that happens in it with close attention, because this was the county and the county observed everything. Elena came in on Wyndham's left, which was the side that put him between her and the door, and she was aware of this arrangement, and of the fact that she had not asked for it, and that he had simply done it. The evening went well. It went better than she had expected. She talked to Mrs. Hartley, who was genuinely glad to see her, and who had the grace not to comment on the green dress or the hair or the 3-year absence in any way that required a response. She talked to a woman she had known slightly before London, who was now married with 2 children, and was interested in the estate management questions in a genuine way. She talked to Cecily, who was full of the pleasure of being at a gathering with her sister, and managed to control it to the point where she only said I told you so once, very quietly, while Elena was getting her a second glass of lemonade. And then she saw him. He was on the far side of the room, talking to a man she did not recognize, and he looked up at the same moment she saw him, the way people do in crowded rooms when someone they are thinking about comes into view. He looked, he recognized, he smiled the smile she remembered. Elena felt the old cold move through her, fast and familiar, and she stood with it, the way she had learned to stand with things that were not going to be escaped from by running. And then Wyndham was beside her. He did not touch her. He simply stood there on her left with the physical presence of a man who takes up the right amount of space and does not need to do anything to make that space felt. He looked across the room, the man looked back. Elena did not see what happened in that look. She was looking at a painting on the wall, a landscape, an autumn field, quite well done. She was looking at it with the focused interest of a woman whose mind was very occupied elsewhere and who needed something solid to rest her eyes on. Whatever happened in that look lasted perhaps 3 seconds. When Elena turned back, the man was no longer looking at her. He was talking to his companion again. He did not look at her again for the rest of the evening. Wyndham, at her left, said nothing. She did not ask what he had said. She thought, from the quality of the silence, that he might not have said anything at all, that sometimes the simple fact of presence, correctly placed, was enough. They left before 10. In the carriage, Cecily talked for 20 minutes without pause about the new piano and Mrs. Hartley's niece and the quality of the refreshments, and Elena listened and answered and smiled in the right places, and Wyndham sat across from them and said very little and looked, once, at Elena with an expression that contained more than she had words for. When they arrived at the hall, Cecily went in ahead of them with her usual enthusiasm, calling back something about a novel she wanted to find, and Elena stood at the foot of the steps in the cold January night and looked up at the clear sky, which was full of stars in the way winter skies are full of stars when the air is very cold and very clean. She will be fine, Wyndham said behind her. She turned. He meant Cecily, the general happiness of Cecily, the social creature of Cecily who had needed an evening like this and had gotten one. Yes, Elena said, she will. He looked at her for a moment. You were fine tonight, he said. I want to say that plainly. She looked at him. I was, she said, and it was true, and saying it was true was important. I was fine, and I do not want to be managed, and I am grateful that you did not try to manage me. He looked at her with the steadiness she had come to think of as specifically and entirely his. I would not, he said. I know, she said. That is part of why I am telling you that I was fine. He looked at the stars for a moment, then he looked at her again. I will see you Tuesday, he said. Tuesday, she agreed. He rode away. Elena stood at the foot of the steps for another moment, in the cold January night, under the stars, in the green dress she had worn for herself. She went inside. She went to her desk, not to work, just to sit for a moment in the room she had spent 3 years building into something steady and real. She sat in the particular quiet of a house that runs on work and the people who do it. She thought about all of it. She thought about 3 years and green dresses and gray eyes and Tuesdays and the South Lane in December and a letter in the bottom drawer. She thought about the hall, old and a little tired and still beautiful in its way, and how much she had loved it in all its imperfection, all its honest wear. She thought about letting something in. She thought about how long she had believed she could not, and how wrong she had been, and how the wrongness of it was not frightening particularly. She sat there until the fire was low, and then she went to bed, and she slept well, and in the morning she was up before the house, and the day began as her days always began, with work and intention and the particular pleasure of a life that was, finally, opening again. He asked her on a Thursday, not a Tuesday. Elena had noticed over the months that Wyndham's most significant moments had a tendency to fall outside the expected pattern. He had come back in January when he had said February. He had stayed 15 minutes too long in October when he had only intended to ask 4 questions. He had stood beside her at the Hartley gathering without being asked or invited, simply because he had read the situation accurately and had made the decision he considered correct. He came on a Thursday in March, which was not on any agreed schedule, on a morning when the mud from the winter thaw had finally begun to firm up, and the earliest thing in the kitchen garden, the sorrel, was showing green at the edges of the bed. Elena was in the estate office with the spring accounts open and the window letting in the first real warmth of the year, and she heard his horse and felt, without consciously registering it, the thing she had been feeling every time she heard his horse on the lane for 5 months, a quality of arrival, the particular sensation of something you have been waiting for arriving without the waiting having been a burden. She had stopped finding this alarming sometime in February. She had simply decided it was the truth, the way you accept a column of figures when it adds up correctly every time you check it. He came in and sat down and put his hat on the chair and said, I have been thinking about what comes next for the estate survey. The county record office wants a final filing by April. I know, she said, I have drafted the summary. I know you have, Jeffrey mentioned it. She looked up, Jeffrey mentioned it. I called on Jeffrey yesterday. Elena put down her pen, she looked at him. Jeffrey Oakes did not receive social calls from Dukes. Jeffrey Oakes received Elena on Tuesday mornings and the Ashwick replacement steward, a young man named Morton, on quarterly visits for boundary questions. He did not receive James Wyndham. Why did you call on Jeffrey? She said. Wyndham looked at her with his customary directness. Because I wanted to know how the northern field drainage has been holding up since the work in January, and because I wanted to ask him a question. About the drainage? No, he said, not about the drainage. Elena sat very still. I asked him, Wyndham said, whether he thought you were happy here. She looked at him for a long moment. The spring warmth was in the window. The sorrel was coming green in the kitchen garden outside. The estate accounts were open on her desk, the numbers she had balanced and the columns she had made correct, the proof of 3 years' work. What did he say? She said. He said you were the best manager this property had seen in 40 years, and that you worked too hard and did not sleep enough, and that you had been, recently, somewhat less gray about the eyes than you used to be. Elena looked at her desk. And then he said, Wyndham continued, in the quiet, careful voice he used for things that mattered, that he thought you deserved more than this, but that you would have to decide that yourself, because you were the most stubborn person he had ever known, and he meant it as a compliment. She looked up. Wyndham was watching her with the most open expression she had ever seen on him, which was still not very open by most people's standards, but which was, for him, the equivalent of laying everything out on the desk in order and leaving it there to be read. I am not proposing because you are lovely, he said. Though you are. I am not proposing because of the portrait or the green dress or anything that has to do with what you look like. I am proposing because you found the falsified column in my brother-in-law's accounts before my solicitor did, and told me about it without making it a situation, and because you run 400 acres without anyone seeing the work it costs, and because you read the quarterly agricultural reports looking for what you have missed rather than what you already think, and because you put a deliberate error in the 1831 survey in October to test whether I would catch it. And I have not told you that I know about that, but I know about it, and I want you to know I know about it, and... He stopped. He breathed. And he said more quietly, because the quality of my own life has been different since October, in a way I find I cannot attribute to anything else, and I would rather have the thing itself than continue attributing the improvement to something I am not naming. The spring light sat in the room, easy and warm. Elinor looked at her hands. The ink was on them as always. She thought about all the Tuesdays and the survey documents and the long gallery and the South Lane and the Hartley gathering and Harriet and Geoffrey and Cecily and the green dress worn for herself, and she thought about a question asked without pressure in a cold, long gallery. She thought about the girl in the white dress and the woman at the desk, and the distance between them that was not loss but passage. She said the deliberate error was in the lower left panel of the 1831 survey, not the notation. You corrected the notation, but you also corrected the error 3 visits later without mentioning either of them, and I have not told you that I know that you know, but I know, and I would like you to know I know. Something happened in his face, the actual smile, not the version of it. It lasted longer than 2 seconds this time. Elinor, he said. I need to say something before I answer, she said. He waited. I am not going to change, she said. I am going to keep the accounts and read the agricultural reports and manage this property because I am good at it, and because I want to. I am going to wear the work coat when there is work to be done, and the green dress when I feel like wearing the green dress, and I am not going to perform any version of anything for anyone, including you. I know, he said. And I am not yet easy in company, and I may never be as easy in it as I was before, and that is something that belongs to me, and is not available to be managed or corrected or improved. I know that too, he said. She looked at him, he looked at her. Yes, she said. He was quiet for a moment, then yes. Yes, she said again, and the word was simple and clean and right, the way things are right when they have been understood correctly. He did not reach across the desk for her hand. He did not say anything theatrical. He simply sat across from her in the estate office on a Thursday morning in March, in the first real warmth of the year, and looked at her with the same quality of attention he had been looking at her with since October, and she looked back, and neither of them needed to make it into more than it was, because what it was already more than enough. They sat for a while in the quiet, and then Elinor opened the spring accounts again, and he opened the folder he had brought, and they worked through the April survey filing together, which was what they had come to do, and which was, Elinor thought, exactly the right way to begin. She wrote to Cecily that afternoon. The letter was 4 words. I said yes, come home. Cecily arrived within the hour, having apparently been reading in the sitting room the entire time, and not in Bath as she had said that morning, and the sound she made when Elinor confirmed it was the sound of 3 years of patience being very loudly rewarded. Elinor let her be loud about it. She had earned it. She went back to the spring accounts. She balanced them before supper. She sat at the desk in the last of the afternoon light and listened to Cecily telling Mrs. Poole in the kitchen, in considerable detail, everything she had observed over the past 5 months and had been holding in with great personal effort. The kitchen was warm and loud and thoroughly alive. The estate office was quiet. Elinor sat in the quiet with the balanced accounts and the window open to the March evening, and thought about how long you can make a life from the management of what you are afraid of, and how much more interesting it is, when you finally stop, to begin managing what you actually want. She wanted this, all of it, the work and the hall and the sorrel coming green and the accounts and the Tuesdays and the man who had looked at her portrait and then at her and asked the right question. She wanted to be seen, and she had been seen, and she had kept going anyway. This was, she thought, precisely enough. The wedding was in April, when the fields outside the hall were the bright green of early spring and the kitchen garden had come properly alive, and the pair of missile thrushes who had nested in the old apple tree at the corner of the garden, every year Elena could remember were back again, loudly certain of their right to the place. Elena had wanted it small, Wyndham had wanted it small, Cecily had wanted something slightly larger, but had been overruled with such quiet efficiency that she had conceded in under 10 minutes, which was a personal record. The ceremony was held at the church in the village, attended by Harriet and Charles Caldwell, Cecily, Geoffrey Oakes and his wife, Mrs. Poole, Agnes, and 8 other people who represented between them everyone Elena trusted and everyone Wyndham felt any genuine warmth toward. The vicar, an older man who had known Elena since childhood, said the words. Elena said hers without hesitation. Wyndham said his with the precise and serious quality he brought to everything that mattered, which was the quality that she had learned to trust most completely. Harriet cried, which she did with the confident openness of a woman who considers emotion at appropriate moments to be perfectly respectable. Cecily cried because Harriet was crying, and because she was Cecily, and because 3 years of patience had arrived at their destination. Geoffrey Oakes did not cry, but he stood in the back of the church with his hands behind his back and the expression of a man who considers the day's business to have come out correctly. Afterward in the hall, Eleanor's hall still, which was what she had wanted, and which Wyndham had agreed to without any discussion about it, because he was a man with 3 other properties, and no attachment to any of them that compared to Eleanor's attachment to this one, Harriet gave a toast. It was not short, Harriet's toasts were not short. It covered their meeting, their first year of friendship, the particular quality of her brother's character that she had spent 15 years observing, and the changes she had seen in him since October. It covered Eleanor's management of the estate with the specific admiration of someone who has asked enough questions to understand the work involved. It covered, briefly and with warmth, the fact that it had taken both of them an unusually long time to arrive at the obvious, which was Harriet's way of saying what she thought without making it a complaint. She finished with, "My brother is a man who notices everything. He noticed the right thing this time. He can be very wise when he stops being too set in his ways." Wyndham said from across the table, the same could be said of Elena. Elena looked at him, he looked at her. It was a look that had the entire autumn and winter in it, every Tuesday, every question, every silence, the long gallery and the south lane and the green dress worn for herself, and a name said across a desk for the first time. "Yes," Cecily said, in the tone of a woman who has been vindicated on every point. "It could." Elena raised her glass. "To Geoffrey," she said, "who told the truth to a duke without being asked." Geoffrey, across the table, allowed himself a very small smile. His wife patted his hand. They had the wedding supper and a cold evening and a fire in the sitting room and Harriet at the piano, which she played well, and Cecily next to her turning pages with the focused attention of someone who has decided this evening is to be treated as a gift and attended to accordingly. Elena sat beside Wyndham in the chair that had been her father's and looked at the room she had kept, and the people in it and the fire that was doing what fires do when they are tended carefully, and thought that the accounting of a life was not so different from the accounting of an estate. You put in what you could, you found the money where you found it, you balanced what needed balancing and let the rest be what it was. She had been balancing for 3 years, she had done it well. And now she was doing something different, and that was fine too, and the hall was still standing, and the thrushes were back in the apple tree, and the sorrel was coming green in the kitchen garden, and the accounts were in order. She looked at Wyndham, he looked at her. "Tuesday," he said very quietly, which meant, "the accounts, the survey, the real work of a shared life, all the ordinary and important things." "Tuesday," she agreed. The fire burned on, the thrushes settled for the night. Harriet played something that Cecily liked and Cecily said so, and Harriet played it again. Outside, the April night was mild and dark and full of the sound of spring, which does not announce itself but arrives, the way all the best things do, simply and without ceremony, and is suddenly and entirely present before you have finished noticing that it has come. 30 years later, the estate office smelled the same. Old paper and coal smoke, and the particular dry smell of a room that has been used for careful thinking for a very long time. 2 sets of spectacles sat on the desk, Elena's, with a small repair at the right hinge that she had been meaning to have properly fixed for 3 months, and Wyndham's, which were newer and slightly too strong for the close work, but which he refused to replace on the grounds that his previous pair had suited him fine for 6 years, and changing opticians was unnecessary. Eleanor was at the south window with the ledger for the Northern Tenant Review, a set of accounts that had grown more complex over 30 years as the estate had grown more complex, and the afternoon light was doing what afternoon light does in March, trying, not quite succeeding, arriving at something that was between winter and spring without being entirely either. Wyndham was at the desk with the Ashwick accounts, which were his now in the full sense. The steward he had hired in 1848 had served 22 years and retired in excellent health and been replaced by a young man named Gerald Morton, who was Geoffrey Oak's nephew and had his uncle's capability and his uncle's hat and his uncle's distrust of numbers that did not add up on the first attempt. Geoffrey himself had retired at 72, with a dinner at the Hall and a gift of a good coat and Eleanor's genuine and abiding respect, which he had received with the same composure with which he had received everything for 30 years. They had been working in the office for 2 hours. The fire was low but not out. The winter light was, slowly, becoming spring light, and Eleanor had not called for more coal yet because the quality of the afternoon did not quite justify it, and because she was comfortable in her chair with the ledger and the work that still interested her as genuinely as it ever had. She was 55. She did not feel 55 in any way that she could particularly identify. She felt like a woman who had been doing the same work for 30 years and was still finding it worth doing, which seemed to her the correct and appropriate way to feel about a life. She had lines around her eyes from decades of reading in imperfect light, and her hair was gray at the temples now and had been for some years, and her hands had the permanent quality of hands that have done real work for a long time, useful and marked by use and entirely her own. She had worn the green dress twice more over the years, and then, when it no longer fit as it had, she had had it let out once and then accepted the fact of it and bought another dress in a similar green that she wore when she felt like wearing it, which was more often now than it had been in the beginning, because she had stopped thinking of colors and effort as invitations extended to other people and started thinking of them as simply the truth of what she liked. Wyndham looked up from the Ashwick accounts. "The March column in the third ledger," he said. Eleanor looked at the March column in her third ledger. She found it in under 3 minutes, as she always did. She read him the total. He wrote it down. She went back to the Northern Tenant Review. Outside, the March afternoon was doing its uncertain work, and the thrushes were back in the apple tree, not the original thrushes, obviously, but their inheritors, the pair that had arrived 2 springs ago and had shown every sign of intending to stay permanently, which Eleanor considered a reasonable decision. Cecily had married a good-natured man from Bristol named Arthur Pemberton, who bred horses and had a large capacity for happiness, and who found Cecily to be the most interesting person he knew, which she was. They lived an hour's drive away and visited often. Cecily had 3 children, all of whom found their Aunt Eleanor considerably more interesting than she found herself, which she thought spoke well of them. Harriet Caldwell was 71 and still in London, still writing letters of 6 pages, still playing the piano with confident skill, and still telling anyone who would listen that she had been instrumental in the whole business from the beginning, which was approximately true in the way that Harriet's versions of events were generally approximately true. Charles Caldwell had died 4 years ago of a quiet and dignified illness, and Harriet had grieved for him with the same warm openness she brought to every emotion, and then she had continued, because she was Harriet and continuation was what she did, and she wrote to Eleanor every month and Eleanor wrote back. The man from the Mayfair gathering had lost his standing through a combination of investments he did not understand and debts he could not pay, and had retired to a smaller property far in the north of England, and was not, to Eleanor's knowledge, anyone's concern any more. She had learned of this in a letter from Clara Pemberton, and had noted it with the same expression she used when a set of accounts finally balanced after a long time of not balancing. Then she had put the letter away and thought about other things. She thought about other things routinely and without effort. This had taken a while to achieve, and she was grateful for it. The fire crackled. The ledger had its numbers in their columns. Eleanor wrote the final total for the Northern Tenant Review and sat back in her chair and looked at the number for a moment, checking it against the sum she had been holding in her head. It was right, it was always right when she had done it. Wyndham looked up again. He looked at her across the room the way he had been looking at her across rooms for 30 years, with the directness that had not altered and the attention that had not diminished, and the quality of seeing that was the most consistent and reliable thing she knew. "Done," he said. "Done," she said. He put down his pen, she put down hers. The afternoon light was, finally, choosing spring. It came through the south window at the angle of almost March and sat on the desk and the papers and the 2 pairs of spectacles and the ink on Alina's hands, which had never, not in 30 years, been entirely clean. She looked at her hands. She looked at the window. She looked at the man across the desk who had walked into this room 30 years ago with a map and a question, and who had looked at her face with the same attention he brought to documents, and had not said any of the wrong things, not once, not in 30 years. "Tuesday," she said, which meant tomorrow and the accounts and the ordinary important work of everything. "Tuesday," he agreed. She picked up her spectacles. He picked up his. The fire needed coal now, she decided, and she went to find it, moving through her own estate office with the brisk and unhurried ease of a woman who has been entirely at home in her own life for a very long time and intends to remain so. The coal went on the fire took hold. Outside, the thrushes in the apple tree were very certain about the spring. She went back to her chair, and the afternoon opened out, warm and real and entirely present, and she settled into it the way she settled into everything she had chosen to keep without ceremony, without decoration, with the simple and complete attention of a woman who has learned, at last, that the things worth having are the ones you reach for yourself, and hold on to and do not put down.